Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
This is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore the idea of the Momento Mori, the idea of the reminder of death. And it seems like a dark topic, but then again, National Depression Day, the most depressed day of the year, is sometime in the middle of January, so it seems fitting, but it's actually not as depressing as one would think. We see a very old practice in many societies, this reminder that we will die, whether it's in Masonry, which we do see in our ritual, or whether it's Stoicism, whether it's forms of Catholicism, forms of Buddhism, other Eastern faiths. We often see this idea of the reminder of death. And it's important. It's probably one of the most important things that we can remind ourselves of every day. And it gets into some larger issues of Freemasonry. So let's get into it. It is the practice of reflection on personal mortality that would become very popular in the Middle Ages. And the idea was this focus on considering the transience of life, the futility of pleasure, and the certainty of death. It was a way of improving one's character by focusing their lives on the virtuous, by turning one's attention towards immortality of the soul and the afterlife. Even if you don't want to do good things because of what's in front of you now, you may want to do them for the immortal or the eternal rewards that it brings you later. The idea is also found artistic expression in European Christian art, a lot in the medieval and the Renaissance. We see, for example, an image known as the Momento Mori, a reminder of death, oftentimes a skull or skeleton hidden in a piece of art. We see the Danse Macabre with its dancing Grim Reaper carrying off rich and poor alike in another example. And these examples come out of a time when the plague is rampant across Europe. The bubonic plague, starting in about 1347, rampages Europe, takes out 1/3 to 1/2 of the total population. And it changes the way people look at things. It changes the world. It arguably gives us the Renaissance. And the idea of the Momento Mori carries into the Renaissance later. We see these Danse Macabre, we see these Momento Mori regularly. We find them in funerary art, architecture, literature, jewelry, music, timepieces of the era, paintings of the era. It's all over the place. My goal here is to look at these ideas and tie them into Masonry. Of course, many of us are aware of this idea of the chamber of reflection. For those of you that aren't aware of it, it's normally a small darkened room adjacent to a lodge room where a candidate for initiation in some of the degrees at various times in our history has been able to reflect and meditate on the journey they're about to undertake. Typically, you go in there, there's a skull, there's a candle, there's a table, usually a pen and paper so you can write your thoughts. And the idea is to sit in perfect silence, to contemplate what is the great beyond. So my objective here is to discuss why each of us, as Freemasons, still need the solitude and need this idea of reflection on our daily lives. So we're looking at ideas of solitude. We're looking at ideas of general reflection, but also growth. You see, the trick to the Momento Mori, the trick to these reminders of death, is that it reminds us that there will come a time, that we should live our lives as if that day could be today, tomorrow, or next week, rather than thinking about it as 40 years from now. Why? Because thinking about 40 years from now leads to procrastination. If vampires actually existed, they would be the laziest people in the world. Because at the end of the day, if you're immortal, you have no reason to be concerned about those things that are due tomorrow. You literally have all of time to do it. But we don't. We're humans. We need that sense of presence. We need something to pull us back when we're scrolling constantly through our phones or whatever else, looking at material. So there's a great quote. All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. This is by Blaise Pascal. Pascal also argues that without God, our spiritual condition is a state of misery, kind of bringing in this religious element to it. And oftentimes we do see these practices tied to religious or what we would see as spiritual practices. He further suggests that we could sit still and honestly look inside ourselves, and we would begin to recognize our despair. We, however, spend most of our time blocking out or concealing our true condition by using various forms of self-deception. He calls this continual need an addictive tendency to seek out mindless and soul-numbing forms of entertainment or amusement. He calls them distraction or diversion. He uses the term divertissement, which I am horribly mispronouncing. These diversions can be immoral. They could be drunkenness, sexual promiscuity, but more often they take the form of habits that are merely wasteful or self-indulgent. Things like gaming, sports, even the arts to some degree. Anything that we're trying to get away from life. All of the luxuries, consumer goods, and creature comforts that surround ourselves with every day are, at the end of the day, distractions. We use them as a way of concealing our bleak inner reality from ourselves, from one another. And this reminds me of an art class that I taught. I taught art history at UW-Whitewater, and I would often talk about Rothko. And Rothko was famous for creating these large paintings with seemingly no composition, and there really was no composition. The idea was that your mind would kind of fill it in. You would stop, you would stand in front of it, it would take up all of your peripheral vision, and you'd be in sensory deprivation. You'd be in a silent space with a blank canvas, just you and your thoughts. And these were some of the most powerful pieces of art because they would bring people to emotional crises. People would break down in museums in tears in front of these paintings. And they did so not because of the painting, but because the painting was reflecting, well, basically their own thoughts back at them. They had no choice but to deal with their thoughts, and we spend a lot of time trying to avoid exactly that. And that's what Pascal is getting at. So we also have a sense of intrinsic dignity and worth. We have rational thought, which is the attribute of our nature that elevates us and separates us from the rest of the universe. It also separates us from the animals. And that rational thought, that consciousness, means that we have the ability to pick and choose what we do. We can pick and choose to be present. We can spend time in a quiet room solely with our thoughts. And I would challenge you to do that. Start with no more than a minute or two and let it grow. Those same college students, when I would ask them about this sort of sensory deprivation experience, would tell me that most of them, 99% of them, were very uncomfortable being alone with their thoughts and with their ideas. They were far more comfortable if they got home to their dorm room and flipped on the TV, the stereo, whatever else, create sound, create something, so they would avoid silence. And I would argue that we very much do everything in our power to avoid silence, to avoid looking inward and really starting to recognize who we are as people, who we are as beings, who we are on this earth, and that time is limited. And that's the beauty of this idea, the reminder of death, is if our time is limited, you tend to make different decisions. And we see this in Masonic teaching, but we see it everywhere. The idea being, if you thought that you were going to die tomorrow, or you reminded yourself constantly that you were going to die, and the Stoics would have done this typically 5 times a day, then those decisions that you make about what you do change. Maybe instead of scrolling Reddit, you decide, you know what, I'm going to pick up that book because it's going to expand who I am and answer some very deep questions. Maybe you decide that instead of wasting your time worried about a situation that you have absolutely no control over, instead you should recognize you only have so much time on this earth, and is it really worth it? It becomes a barometer by which we make decisions, and that's really the power of it, the Momento Mori. Now, we can apply this today, but it becomes a problem today. Because while Pascal's themes are relevant then as now, we now live in a time when most of us carry distractions in our pocket, which allows us to access the internet, where we go to sites like Facebook and Twitter to argue with strangers and look at pictures of cats. We post photos showing selfies, pets, families, but they don't really represent who we are. It creates a false impression of who we are, but also a false impression of everyone around us. Without that basis of reflection, without that willingness to sit in a quiet room and just think for a little bit, it could be very easy to get carried away and think, wow, this guy, Mike Consiglio, has an amazing life. I really wish I had it. And so it becomes the sort of situation that we're trying to avoid. And most people are addicted to this behavior. For example, walking around at UW-Whitewater, but it could be at my current school or anywhere else, you will see firsthand that we see masses of zombies shambling across campus, not paying attention to anything around them, frequently running into people, walking into water fountains, whatever the situation is, and they're completely oblivious to everything around them. And this is terrifying because those distractions keep us from being present, keep us from life. And would we still take those times to be distracted if we were contemplating this memento mori, this reminder of death? So what's the solution? Well, when was the last time you sat quietly, lost in contemplative or meditative thought? The working tools of Masonry are meant to help build the spiritual temple within yourself. The ability to contemplate or meditate on one's existence, one's purpose, one's relationship with God, the universe, mankind, and one's own mortality are the foundations on which Masonry is built. And just a reminder, there are very specific lessons that we learn to A, not fear death, and B, to accept our mortal limits. And so why aren't we using these ideas? Why aren't we sitting there and contemplating our own demise such that it changes the way that we make decisions and look at the world, look at our lives, look at what we choose to do in any given moment? It's only when we come to reflect that we come to understand the wisdom, strength, and beauty, not only of Masonry, but of the world around us. We can start to have authentic experiences, thoughts, and actions that are free from the shackles of distraction. And if you spend that time watching the news, then your mind will be on those things rather than on your own growth and development. I'm not saying shut the rest of the world out all the time. I'm saying take some time during your day to shut the rest of the world out, even for a few minutes. Contemplate your own mortality, your place in the universe, all those things that hurt, that give you a headache to really consider, and do it for a reason. It will begin to improve your life because the world will become more beautiful. It becomes more beautiful because we're more conscious of it. If you think that your demise is much closer than it is, then you're more likely to sit there and look at that sunset. Sit there and ponder the beauty of a butterfly or the glory of creation. It is our state of authentic consciousness in which we begin to understand the grandeur of the spiritual, much like Pascal begins to understand it. The ennui that we suffer, this sort of low depression that we suffer, which causes us to seek out these distractions, is a result of a denial of our longing to be one with ourselves, to understand ourselves. It's going to hurt to begin to understand yourself, to begin to look inward, but it is necessary. And I understand there are times in life where things get busy for 6 months and this is not going to happen. And that's fine. Perfection is not a human trait. You are not meant to hit this out of the park the first time. But when you do, you will find a beauty that can only be found through the contemplation of one's own mortality, in our own chamber of reflection, our contemplative thought process, which brings us back into a state of oneness with ourselves, with who we truly are, including those parts that we try and hide from ourselves and others, but also a state of oneness with the universe, with the spiritual, with God, whatever your belief system happens to be. This is why I believe a chamber of reflection, or the concept behind it, the idea of getting away and being lost with nothing more than your thoughts, becomes more relevant now than ever in Freemasonry, because we are surrounded by these things that scream at us day to day, that are built to be addictive, that are built to keep your attention no matter what. And we need to find a way to get away from them so that we can have perspective, so that we can have the wisdom of the ages, so that we can understand our place in the world and in the universe, and thus be able to filter better and understand, for example, whether that news is important to me or not, whether the stuff that I'm seeing online has any real bearing on me, or if I'm just sitting here doing nothing and I could be doing something that would help my fellow man, my spiritual development, the community, my family. There's so many things that we can do when we begin to consider that we are only here for so much time. And that's all I'm asking you to do. Consider the Momento Mori. Practice it for a week or a month. Just sit, contemplate your own demise, and see what happens. I think you'll find it's a dark practice with an amazingly light and useful purpose in our life. Thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Linke, and the entire Further Light team in your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.